Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. So welcome to PSC 603 Budgeting and Fiscal Administration. This is the week 6 class of the spring 22 semester. And tonight we're going to have a discussion about probably my favorite topic in this area because I've been working in it professionally for over 2 decades, and that is state and local budgeting. And talk a little bit also about state, and local financial management, and deal more specifically with the laws that govern processes here in this state, which are handled by the North Carolina Local Budget and Fiscal Control Act. So what I want to do is go ahead and move over to the screen. Everybody can see the slide, correct? Okay, good. So our overview tonight, we'll have some discussion with respect to Chapter 5, and then I will go over the Local Budget and Fiscal Control Act. I have made it available for the Local Budget and Fiscal Control Act. It is available. There is a folder in the Google Drive area for reference documents, and these are actually items that we're going to look at tonight. And one of them is the legislation, the statutes with respect to the bill here in North Carolina. There's also a reference document that's about 20 years old called Our State, Our Money, which provides some information about state budgeting processes. And I've also included in there an overview of the highlights for the current state budget, which is for the biennium from the calendar years 2021 to calendar year 2023. So some good information that I'll take the opportunity for us to look at over the course of this evening. Once we finish our discussion, we'll take a 15-minute break, and then we'll get into the lab exercise portion. First thing I will do is I will review and take any follow-up questions that anybody has with respect to the budget worksheet. I received a couple of questions late this afternoon, and I'm going to cover those first. So those people who may have emailed me those questions, don't worry, I did get them. I just didn't have a chance to respond, but I will cover them in class because they're similar to some other questions that people have asked. And then we will get into the next lab, which will be on expenditures. And before I begin, let me just tell you that the assignment on expenditures the date on the deadline for that has changed. It will not be due until Friday, March 4th. So y'all don't have to worry about that in terms of getting it done by next Monday. It'll be due on Friday the 4th. I do apologize for the way that the labs have been kind of not done as timely as they should be, and that's just, as I said before, we had some communication and technology issues here, and we've worked those out. So let me get into, are there any questions to start off with? Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. So Dr. Mikesell, professionally and in his work at Indiana University, was an advisor pretty regularly on state budget processes in the state of Indiana. He had a little bit of involvement in local budgeting, and he had some involvement in federal budgeting. Plus, he did a lot of advising in the development of budgeting and financial systems across the world, particularly in Europe. There was a lot of work that was done by American academics following the end of the Cold War, where they traveled to various Eastern European countries to help them establish independent financial systems. Their financial systems were, in terms of their governmental financial systems, were not very complex, not very well organized. And so they traveled throughout the 90s and the 2000s advising these countries on how to develop more modern budget systems. And he was one of the ones who did that. His approach in this chapter is kind of just more to talk in vague terms about budgeting at the state and local level. And as he points out, the reason why is in the American system of federalism, there are no real constraints passed down from Washington about the internal management structures of government. There are some givens with respect to how state government should operate, but there's very limited information in terms of how the infrastructure of public administration should work at the state and local level. This is different from federal systems that we see all across the world, including in Canada and in Europe, that we're often compared to, in that in most other countries, particularly we're talking about industrialized countries, but even non-industrial countries that wouldn't be considered industrialized countries, a lot of their structure is heavily influenced, if not mandated, by what takes place at the national level. So even though you may have, like in Canada, you have provincial and local governments, provinces being equivalent to states here, the governments are pretty much nationally managed and organized. It's more of a corporate structure. And here in the United States, there's a lot higher degree of independence. Local governments are the total creation of the states, just like counties are, municipalities are. They're subject to the various laws and regulations and code with respect to how they can exist and how they organize and the types of services they provide. And even states, even though there's a lot of similarities and there's a lot of expectations in terms of how states are structured, they have a lot of flexibility as well. And so Mike Sell kind of starts off the chapter talking about that. What it means is that the experimental or the kind of heterogeneous nature of government at the state and local level in the United States means you have a lot of different budget systems, several different financial management systems. They all utilize generally accepted accounting principles, but they all have their own unique characteristics. And so as he goes through this chapter, he's not trying to prescribe any particular budget system or budget approach or financial management approach at the local level. He's trying to provide a survey of that, which is why we're going to spend time talking about the general concepts that are provided in the chapter, and then move on to talking about what we do here in North Carolina. Because while I can imagine that some of you will be looking at opportunities outside of North Carolina, I also would imagine that many of you are looking at opportunities or continuing your professional careers here in North Carolina. So it makes sense to focus our attention more on that. I can answer a few questions about systems in Georgia and Virginia because I worked in those states, but we will focus primarily, and there are differences even between our systems in Georgia and systems in Virginia and North Carolina. One of the challenges that he talks about early on with respect to how financial management works at the state and local level is understanding the aspect of constraints. And there are two different types of constraints at this point that I want for us to talk about. The first one are constraints on authority, and the other is on fiscal constraints. What is a good example that somebody can give of an authority constraint?
Would this
Yes.
be like the kind of section where we're talking about the balance of power between the executive and legislative powers and functions over the budget, sort of like who gets veto power over like certain line items, or if the budget is made by the executive and sent to the legislator, it's more of like a joint process, like that kind of thing?
That is certainly part of it. That's perhaps a little more specific than that, but it's certainly a part of it. The systems are structured differently in terms of what roles executive and legislative branches play in the development of budgets. Typically, budgets are in most state constitutions, the power of the purse, as it's known, is specifically tied to the legislative branch. But in a lot of states, there are guidance, and even from a constitutional perspective or a statute perspective, that require the governor to submit a budget to kind of be a starting off point. And then once a budget is adopted or executed, was adopted by the legislative branch and then signed into law by the governor, it then becomes the governor's responsibility to execute funding. John makes a good point. You can't order an intern to do what a treasurer is constitutionally mandated to do. Absolutely, that's true. There are certain limitations on the role within an organization. This goes back to our discussion previously about control systems, part of general accepted accounting principles, but internal controls. But the reality that there are people, given how their duties are described, perhaps like, for example, in the North Carolina Constitution, there are certain duties and functions and responsibilities they have that are specifically outlined, and they have specific duties that they have to perform. And it can be as mundane as, like, at the local level, typically your finance officer, however that's defined, whether it's an elected person or it is normally in North Carolina, it's a member of professional staff. They have to sign off on all checks, which means they have to review all the backup associated with a check before they can sign it. So they have to do that, and that's one of their responsibilities. What's another example?
Well, I guess nationally they can create money, and state and local doesn't really have that. Well, they don't have that authority at all. So they can't just, if they get in trouble, it's more difficult to borrow money, and they can't just fix that as easily, I guess.
Yes, that's a good example. From an authority perspective, constitutionally speaking, the federal government is given the power to create currency. And so our money supply is totally controlled by the federal government. And as John points out, that becomes a fiscal constraint, because particularly in the position that the United States in, and there are only a few countries in the world that are in this position, us, China, and maybe 2 or 3 others, we are in a position of sovereign status that our currency serves as what they call a reserve currency. And that makes it much more attractive and is perceived and is believed to be more reliable and stable than other currencies around the world. And what that gives the US the power to do at the federal level is borrow a lot, because our bonds, the vehicle by which we borrow money, are considered a very safe investment. And so it puts us in a position where we can carry more debt, in terms of how we compare kind of what is considered, generally speaking, the credit limit, which is looking at debt as a percentage of gross domestic product, because generally speaking, it is thought to be a safer investment. But again, state and local governments don't have that option. From an authority constraint perspective, local governments are typically limited on how much debt that they can borrow by their states. There's an old formula that's used for this in most states, and that is a percentage of total taxable assessed taxable assessed value. That goes back to when primarily local governments generated their revenue from property taxes before the advent of local percentages of sales tax and other forms of revenue. And that's still the way it's written statutorily. In North Carolina, that's even further in the fact that if a local government wants to borrow over a certain amount, in most cases, and that's typically $500,000 a year, they have to, or they want to borrow money to build a new facility or something like that. They actually have to get the debt approved by a state entity, which is the local government commission, which is an office of the treasury, of the state treasurer. And they have to approve it. And they, of course, look at other condition issues with respect to the ability for the given local jurisdiction to be able to pay back the debt, as well as to be able to operate in a financially secure fashion. So those, as pointed out, authority constraints can also play a role with respect to fiscal constraint. What's another example of a fiscal constraint?
Take medicine.
You already said that the budgets have to be balanced, right? That's one of the fiscal constraints when it's presented.
Right, balancing of budgets, is that the balance aspect is definitely a fiscal constraint.
And then it also has to be balanced when the year is over, at the end of the year?
Uh, it depends on the state. Normally, you can't exceed what you can't do is you can't exceed appropriations. The goal in budget management is to balance at the end of the year so that you are not using reserves. But the reality is there may be circumstances where reserves have to be used. This can happen in situations where, for example, you don't generate as much revenue as you thought you were going to generate. That's not as big of a problem here in North Carolina, but it was, for example, something we had to deal with during the final months of fiscal year 2020 due to the impact of COVID and the lockdowns. That was a challenge because we had a situation where we didn't know for the final 3 months of the fiscal year, for April, May, and June, what sales tax revenues were going to look like. Those of us, there were jurisdictions like ours that then cut our expenditure budgets as best we could to where we could still finish out the year in balance. There were other jurisdictions that said, we'll just have to we don't want to cut our services. So they just figured we'll take the loss and we'll pull it from reserves. But that was a serious challenge. But balancing is typically required from the standpoint of adopting a budget. And it is one of your primary goals with respect to managing it throughout the course of the year. Some good other examples that are brought here of fiscal constraints. Salaries definitely are. Also, I would also go beyond that. Benefits. Benefits can be a challenge, and we're talking about those benefits that are paid on a current basis, like FICA, health insurance for active employees, as well as contributing to pension plans. Pensions is brought up, and there's certainly a lot of attention paid to that at the end of the chapter. Other labor cost and capital cost. Any type of obligation serves as a fiscal constraint, because once you enter into any kind of obligation, whether it's with respect to employee benefits or debt or something like that, that plays a role. Callie brings up about, examples like block grants or like Medicaid. Those are constraints as well, because those have formulas attached to them and they are designated for a particular purpose. So there are regulatory facets that when that money is made available, there's an expectation of certain services being delivered. And however the given state manages it, here in North Carolina, I know it's mostly locally administered by county offices that are coordinated through the state, which in other states they have state offices that are available locally, and it's all managed through the state. The reality is that these services have to be provided. Well, at the same time, there's a limited amount of resources available to provide, both in terms of actually providing the direct service, but also then having the support to provide that service from an administrative and operational perspective. And that's just another example primarily of what state and local governments primarily do, and that's service delivery. The services that most people associate with government, whether it be public safety, infrastructure, parks, community facilities, or various entitlement programs or social assistance programs like Medicaid, are typically provided at the local level, especially here in North Carolina. They're either provided by a municipal government or the county government. And so when it comes to budgeting, the budgets are designed and the financial management systems are designed to accommodate the operation of these programs, because you're directly providing the service. At the state level, there's also programs that states provide, like higher education. That's a state function. You have state agencies like the health, like public health, emergency management, Department of Transportation, that are also involved in programs, and some of them have a combination in that not only do they provide services, but they're responsible for managing and allocating money to local governments for their use. More so at the local level, it's direct service. There are some governments that'll like do small grant programs to nonprofits and other agencies or to the public for business development or for housing. But most of what goes on at the local level is service delivery. there's a good amount of service delivery as well at the state level. Can anybody think of another example of a state service that I haven't mentioned? One that I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm not, I was thinking like correctional facilities, but I couldn't remember if you had said
That's-
it. so.
That's
But
no,
there
I didn't
was a
say
big focus on that in the front of the chapter.
right. Correctional facilities are you do have some county-based correctional facilities, but obviously the state runs most correctional facilities for juveniles, for men and for women, as well as associated medical facilities. Transportation is another one. One, of course, that you deal with in coastal states are ferries. All the ferries along the North Carolina coast are operated by the Department of Transportation. Libraries are predominantly local, but the state does run some, like university libraries and some others. But there are several, but obviously you find at the county level or intergovernmental cases like we have here in Rocky Mount, where you have public libraries. And as we've talked about, welfare programs, various social assistance programs, whatever term you want to use. Those programs are typically, there is some degree of state administration, and then there's also some degree of local administration of those programs. Smart Start, I'm not as familiar, I'm a little bit more familiar with Head Start. Jillian, do you know more about Smart Start? Okay. It's really interesting with some of these programs in that the state definitely allocates funding. And when it comes to these youth education programs like Smart Start and Head Start, sometimes they're done by governments, but for the most part in North Carolina, they're actually done by nonprofit agencies. They are facilitated by nonprofits who manage these programs. We have one here. We have two different agencies here in this area that provide youth educational services, and they're primarily funded by state and federal resources. You have the area agencies on aging. A lot of those are state programs. There's some degree of county administration. A lot of counties now have senior centers and engage with states programs. Wildlife management and CPS are two definite good examples of state service delivery. The state has responsibility for wildlife and forestry management, and then CPS, Child Protective Services, obviously that is also another state function that is typically, I think it's operated through counties, but again, I could be wrong, but there's a county and state court role with that. So excellent examples. And then at the local level, you have, of course, police, you have fire, you have public works for city-owned streets and for city-owned infrastructure, you have parks and recreation. You have some other areas of program delivery, utility operations, planning and development, zoning, and then other programs that deal with quality of life or other necessary community issues. One of the things here in North Carolina that we have to tell people about when it comes to municipal government is, with very few exceptions, we're not involved in education and we're not involved in hospitals. There are a couple of counties that have hospital systems. Nash County is one of them. They have a hospital that's aligned with the UNC system, and also we do not. The city does not have a school system. The school system is operated by the county. It's a little unique here because of the boundaries of Rocky Mount, but it's truly a county-based system, and that's due to some Major changes that North Carolina went through in the 90s and the 2000s, where they sought to try to consolidate their public education as much as they could around counties, as opposed to having county and city systems. There are still a few city systems around, like Chapel Hill, Carborough, but most of them are now county systems. Are there any questions in regards to this portion of the chapter?
I have a question.
Sure.
How do, I guess, MPOs, municipal planning organizations, and COGS, Council of Governments, play a role in the, like, I know being that they share, for example, if DOT or some highway stuff comes into play with the MPOs, how do they, I guess, separate the funding, or do they, like, whose budget is that on? Is it on all of theirs, and then they just adjust accordingly?
It all depends upon how the MPO is organized, and I'll give you the example for the MPO we have here in Rocky Mount. So Rocky Mount is considered a metro area. MPO Pradell gave the definition, and metropolitan planning organizations work almost exclusively with transportation planning. And this is a entity that is if you're on, please, if you're not on mute, please go to mute when you can. Okay, thank you. So a metropolitan planning organization basically is an agency that's responsible for developing and preparing transportation projects that either involve multiple local jurisdictions or have the potential to impact multiple local jurisdictions. And MPOs receive a certain percentage of state and federal transportation dollars. So when you're thinking of improvements to interstates or to major highways in your area, like in Greensboro, those would typically go through their planning and development through the MPO. And the MPO is responsible for the development of the planning of these and also assists with the execution. Typically, the way it works, and this is what we do here in Rocky Mount. Rocky Mount maintains and staffs the MPO for our area. So we're kind of like the agent, we're like the jurisdiction of government that houses that agency. So it is included in the general fund of our budget. It is funded predominantly by state and federal transportation dollars for planning purposes. So we budget the revenue associated that we receive for that, and it corresponds to the expenditures. There's a small amount of a local match that we're responsible for. And that money is used to help offset staffing costs, to help offset consultant fees and other costs that are associated with operating the MPO. Council of Governments are a different type of entity. Council of Governments are something you will find nationwide, and what they facilitate is regional planning. They do this in a variety of areas. The most common one that you will find in nationwide is in economic development. There is a document that these councils of governments are responsible for that's updated every 5 years, known as the CEDS, the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy. And basically that document is designed to help formulate and promote a strategic plan for the region when it comes to its economic growth and development. That plan is required for anybody in that region to be able to receive money from the federal government for economic development purposes. And that's facilitated through the primarily through the Economic Development Administration, which is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. There are other things that councils of governments do, like they help smaller local governments with grant writing. They'll help local governments with executive searches. They will administer some programs for the state. For example, we talked about the area agencies on aging. There's actually a grant program there's a grant program for senior centers. It's a state grant program, but it's actually administered by COGS. we receive some money from that each year for equipment that we purchase for our senior center. But they are independent nonprofit organizations. Their membership is comprised of all of the local jurisdictions within their territory, and it's defined by county here in North Carolina, that wish to be part. You pay annual dues, which is to share cost. Rocky Mount is member of what's known as the Upper Coastal Plain Council of Governments, which covers a 5-county area of Northampton, Halifax, Nash, Edgecombe, and Wilson. So the 3 largest cities in that COG are Wilson, us, and Roanoke Rapids. And they're responsible for being support. Like, for example, right now with the Rescue Plan Act, COGS are one of the groups of agencies that have been identified by the state to provide technical assistance to local governments and how they can spend their money from the Rescue Plan Act. A lot of these jurisdictions are not used to receiving federal money directly. So this is a new endeavor for them, and so they're assisting them with the technical requirements associated with receiving and spending these funds. Typically, we just pay that due as what we call a non-departmental expense. Typically, there's a section of the general fund budget where you pay these kinds of fees, which don't really align with any particular department, but are still an obligation or responsibility that you have, because we receive benefit from the COG as well, even though we're the largest jurisdiction in our region. And their focus is a little more directed towards smaller communities than it is on places like Rocky Mount. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Okay. No, that's an excellent question. Are there any others?
I had a question, Professor.
Sure.
Does fiscal constraints also apply to how a local government deals with its debts? So, for example, when the city of Detroit filed bankruptcy,
Yep.
they had a lot of a big majority of their bankruptcy was from legacy debt, pensions and things, and the court wouldn't let them discharge that in the bankruptcy. So they still had to figure out a way to pay that off when they filed bankruptcy. So would that be an example of a fiscal constraint, like how they dealt with their debt?
Absolutely. That is a major fiscal constraint. And this is not as big of an issue in North Carolina because most of your local governments are members of a statewide retirement system that runs parallel to the state employee retirement system, and they're both managed by the treasurer's office. And it's pretty well funded compared to a lot of other pension plans that are out there. But certainly for a lot of municipal governments like Detroit and coming up now, Pittsburgh, there is this issue of pension obligation. And so in the case of Detroit, they had both short-term and long-term fiscal issues, and they were able to get the bankruptcy court to work with them on many of the short-term, but the attitudes with respect to potentially being able to erase some of the pension obligations, the concept when a creditor is forced to take less in a bankruptcy or in a restructuring is known as a haircut. And in that case, they ruled that there would not be a haircut for the pension obligations. That creates a subsequent long-term fiscal constraint because it means that as you're working through restructuring, and then once you get out of bankruptcy and you're now trying to go out there and borrow money and try to do new things, try to recover as a community, you still have the reality that you have a significant obligation. And depending on the city, it's not just about putting the money away for future obligations. It's about making sure that you have the resources necessary to cover current obligations. There are places in the United States, like the Commonwealth of Kentucky, that are dealing with that now. So it's definitely a fiscal constraint. So let's now talk about some of, there were in the chapter, some of the things, and this kind of points out to the ways in which things to look at when you're looking at state and local financial management and budgeting systems and processes. The simplest one to look at is whether they're annual or biennial. Annual meaning that a fiscal year, that the fiscal period lasts the length of 1 year, and biennial meaning that they last 2 years. The state of North Carolina, which does it use?
Biennial.
Right. North Carolina has a biennial budget. And they take they have a night for the last 10, 12, 14 years, they've been rather slow about passing it. Congress still holds the mark for not making it through that process, but the General Assembly has also not been too great about it. What's interesting is that while North Carolina at the state level has a biennial budget, most local governments, there are a few exceptions, but most local governments in North Carolina have annual budgets. The ones that I can think of, the top of my head, that have biennials are Charlotte and Greenville. I can't remember Greensboro for the life of me, and I apologize for that. But most municipal and county jurisdictions in North Carolina have annual budgets. There's also ways in which appropriations can be handled, either through a single appropriation or multiple appropriations. This gets into how the financial structure and how fiscal policy is managed at the state and local level. Typically in North Carolina, things are done as much as possible through single appropriation. That's why we have a state budget that this year, when it was written into as legislation, was close to 1,000 pages. At the federal national level, you have multiple appropriations. There are a multitude of appropriation bills that go through and are deliberated, amended, and then approved by Congress and assigned into the president separately. Right now, there are several of those appropriation bills that have not gone through the congressional process, and so they continue to do these continuing resolutions to extend the prior budget. More than likely, those appropriation bills will be lumped together in what's known as an omnibus, OMNIBUS, that will be adopted. That'll be passed by Congress and then eventually signed by the president. That will include multiple appropriations. But the way the appropriation process is supposed to work at the federal level is that you have multiple appropriations. There are a few times where you will see communities go through a multiple appropriation, particularly if they have if they set aside revenues or they set aside resources for capital. They may choose to go through a capital appropriation process that's independent from their operating appropriation process. But you don't see that a lot. Most of the time, capital is rolled into the into operations as part of appropriations, and that's here when it comes to separation of operating and capital. Sometimes, in most cases, they're not separate, but in a few times they are. In North Carolina, there have been a few cases with special appropriations like bond issues at the state level, where those appropriations will be separate. And you sometimes see that at the local level, and we'll talk about that when we get into the North Carolina Act discussion. But usually, what I have found with municipal governments, for the vast majority of them out there operating in capital, are not separated. This is probably the most important, and that is that you have firm appropriation levels. And what this means is that these are legal limits on how much money can be spent. As I like to say, budgeting is law. And when it comes to the appropriation of funds in a budget, it is restrictive. There are times in federal budgeting, actually, particularly with social programs, where even though a budget's been adopted, those appropriation levels may not necessarily those appropriation levels may be exceeded. In state and local budgeting, those appropriation levels cannot be exceeded, and that's typically controlled at the fund level. So if you've got one department that's going to spend more money than it's got budgeted within a fund, like say the Parks and Rec department is going to spend $100,000 more than it's got budgeted due to the fact that it needs to have additional overtime or part-time. And that means you've got to find $100,000 from another department, or you have to go back to your governing body and increase the appropriation level. But those appropriation levels, unless amended by the governing body, are fixed and firm. So those have to be respected. Another challenge that's out there is typically these governments are not in a position to accommodate deficits. Like the federal government is. Obviously, we talk about, the feds can print money, so they can accommodate whatever deficits they can get away with and have. So that means that if you identify a deficit, particularly as you're planning for a budget, you have to make the necessary adjustments to expenditures and appropriations to offset that deficit. And that deficit typically occurs because, historically speaking, revenues don't keep up with the path of spending. Various costs go up, particularly when it comes to labor. Again, what we do at the state and local level, particularly at the local level, is in general fund operations is heavily dependent on human labor and human capital. And so as the costs for labor go up, increasing pay, increases in benefit costs, whatever the case may be, having to hire additional staff, that puts a significant constraint and forces and typically rises at a rate faster than overall revenue growth. When you have budgeting at the state and local level, in particular at the local level, there is opportunity for direct citizen input. Citizens don't get to vote on budgets directly. In North Carolina, they can vote. They are required to vote as referendum on general obligation debt. And we'll talk more about that when we get to debt later in the semester. But there is the opportunity for citizens to speak out and speak up about the budget. Formally, per state statute, local jurisdictions have to provide at least one public hearing during the budget deliberation process with their governing body. And that is a process that they do. It's not intended to be perfunctory. It is intended to be an honest process. And it's an opportunity for the public to make comments in terms of what's in the budget or what's not in the budget. There is also a greater push in a lot of jurisdictions, particularly larger jurisdictions, to increase public participation in the budget development process. They do this through surveys, they do this through public meetings, they do it through focus groups, through a variety of tools. Participatory budgeting is something that's become more common, and it's advocated by a lot of people. There is also a school that thinks that because, again, these budgets are approved by representative bodies of government, they're approved by either city councils or county commissions, that it's still important that you have the role that the elected officials play in reviewing the budgets and doing their best to consider all the public in terms of making decisions on what needs to be spent. Also, typically in local budgets and even in state budgets, there is greater detail with respect to appropriations. And when we think about this at the account level, we're thinking at the line item, like the budget worksheet example that we've been talking about in lab. And the detailed appropriation not only tells you how much is being spent, but it gives you an idea of what it's actually being used for. Typically at the federal level, that level of detail is not available. They tell you we're going to spend, say, $10 billion on this program, and the documentation developed during the budgeting process really doesn't define, well, what's the program going to look like? Who's going to be eligible for it? It then becomes the responsibility of an executive level agency to kind of flush that out. And that's not necessarily the case at the state and local level. There's a much more defined purpose when it comes to the information that's available in the budgeting process about appropriations. Appropriations can also be earmarked for specific purposes, like grant programs or funding for particular nonprofit agencies. Last two are important. Again, this is where there can be a lot of variance. And this one, the first one is they're both significant. The first one dealing with varying attention to the long term. Obviously, budgeting typically is an annual process. So you're looking at trying to balance for that upcoming fiscal year. At the same time, you've got to be thinking about the long-term impact of current decisions and the potential influences that are going to be created within the overall economy or within your overall community. So not only are you forecasting when we get to, not only are you looking at revenue with respect to what's anticipated for the coming year, but you're also looking at revenue and expenditures over the next, say, 5 years. Now, there's only so far you can really go out with that. Trying to go out beyond 5 years, in my opinion, unless you're an advanced economist, is an exercise in futility. There are some agencies that do it. The GAO has to do it by statute, but the reality is, at the very best, you may be able to have some degree of accuracy looking 5 years ahead. Typically, you're really most certain about 3 years ahead, but you've got to have that information because you need to understand the repercussions and the potential impact of decisions you're making and how they affect the environment, and also how the environment affects you with respect to fiscal performance in terms of talking about conditions and such. And lastly, varying degrees of transparency. Most states have very limited regulations and guidance when it comes to transparency. In North Carolina, for example, it is not required that a budget be posted online by the jurisdiction. They are not required to post the budget online. All they are required to do is make public copies available for viewing. The only place they're actually required to make public copies available for viewing is in their clerk's office. Here in Rocky Mount, we make the budget available online. We also provide a copy at the clerk's office. We have a copy at our public library, and we also make copies available to the media. But we are not required by statute. To do most of that. We do it because it's important for us to do it. Some jurisdictions take transparency to a further degree. They use various visual platforms. It's become very popular in our field to use all these visual platforms that are able to communicate and illustrate the budget online or through other means. They'll do videos. They'll do a lot of information. Some, particularly smaller jurisdictions that lack those resources, just simply make the information out, and that can be a challenge because obviously the more you want, from our perspective, from an ethical perspective, you want as much information out there as possible, and the question becomes, how do you facilitate providing that information? And it proves to be a challenge. Are there any questions with respect to these features when we're looking at various state and local budgeting systems? Okay, James asked, is there a reason why some do not require budgets to be posted online? They just haven't updated the legislation. And I think that there's probably also the view that you do have some communities out there, smaller communities, that probably don't have active websites. They have a website, but it's not regularly updated. You could probably put in place a bill today that says any jurisdiction with a population of at least 10,000 should publish their budget online, and you wouldn't get any pushback to it. Any other questions? Okay. To go back a little bit, when we're talking about constraints, constraints can either be statutory from a legal perspective, and that of course is codified in general statutes here in North Carolina or in the US Code. They can apply to anything with respect to process, with respect to executive authority in administering budgets. They can also be constitutional. And for example, there was a major case in the early 1970s during the Nixon administration where the goal the Nixon administration had with respect to the federal budget was they were trying to reduce the growth in the federal budget because it was their belief that that was helping to encourage a rise in inflation, something we're dealing with now 50 years later. Congress, however, presented a budget to them that was more than what they wanted to spend. So in order to eliminate the political stress this was creating, the president signed the bill. What he then did, and what he believed he had executive authority to do, was he decided to what they call impound the money and simply not allocate it the way that Congress had told him to allocate. He said, basically, yes, you approved the budget. Yes, I signed it, but I don't necessarily have to spend the money or allocate the money as called for. And he was sued. And the case eventually went to the Supreme Court. And the court ruled in most cases that Nixon's actions were unconstitutional, that Nixon did not have the power to impound funds the way that he had tried to do it. One of many overreaches that he did throughout the term of his presidency. But that's an example of a constitutional constraint in that depending on how budgets are set up, for example, if the budget says that you're to appropriate a certain amount of money to say a nonprofit agency, suppose there's an earmark in there for like giving to a particular nonprofit in Greensboro, it's then the responsibility of the executive to facilitate that allowance. There were a lot of those earmarks in the current biennial budget that was adopted by the General Assembly and signed by the governor late last year. And the governor has set up an office to facilitate that. And that's going on right now. Does Linda ask a question to go back? Does having budgets available to the public have an impact on the local budget process? It has some degree of impact with respect to comment. I would say overall it is fairly limited, but it can have an impact if there's particularly a budget issue that generates a lot of discussion or concern in the community, say a new program or a new piece of infrastructure. That can play a role as well. Or if if there's a cut. Friends with gentlemen who used to be the budget director for Mecklenburg County, and in the years following the 2007-2008 real estate crash and stock market crash, they had to make some significant cuts to their budget, and one of those areas was libraries. And so they took a very proactive approach to make sure that the community understood what the financial circumstances were and provided that information to explain why they were going to need to reduce hours at various libraries around the county. Obviously, they got a lot of public comment as a result of it, and a lot of that was driven by the information that was distributed. One of the constraints we talk about, and this can be statutory or constitutional depending on where you are, is the balanced budget requirement. But as Mike Sell talks about, there are different ways that you can define a balanced budget. So when we mean a balanced budget, what we really mean, the ideal balanced budget, I should say, is a budget where your total current revenues and planned use of debt and reserves is equal to the total amount of all expenditures, which include all legal obligations, debt service, and capital. That is a very simple, ideal way to achieve a balanced budget. But there are some ways to get around it. And we'll talk about some of those balancing tricks here in just a second that Mike Sell talks about to finish out our discussion of the chapter. State and local governments can also be restricted in various ways. And the two that I want to focus on, first having to do with financing. States can put in place various provisions that restrict the use of debt more than just financial capacity, than just market capacity to handle the debt. They can put restrictions on the terms. That's what's done here in North Carolina. It's in North Carolina, both at the state and the local level, it is virtually impossible to borrow for a term longer than 20 years. Pretty much all debt issued in North Carolina is 20 years or less. And that is, when you think about that a mortgage is 30 years and there's a lot of bond issues out there that are 30 years, that's a significant difference. But it obviously increases how much you pay in debt on an annual basis. It doesn't increase, it reduces the total cost of the debt, but it does increase how much you pay in the initial phase. There also can be restrictions on investments. Some states like Florida are very open in terms of how local governments can invest their resources, which is why like the city of Miami can right now be talking about wanting to make investments in cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is a very volatile, I mean, it's got a lot of attention, a lot of people have it. It is still a very volatile investment. Typically, the best guidance when it comes to the investment of public funds is very similar to how grandparents invest their money. You're focused on security and liquidity. You want to make sure that debt is secure, and you want to make sure it's easy to liquidate. So what that means is typically you're not as concerned about the rate of return. You want to get something for your money, but you're not as concerned about that. And so what you're trying to do is avoid losing money. So typically that means you put your money in treasury bonds or short-term treasury notes or other secure investment vehicles. Mostly what you're talking about is investing in securities. So that's a significant limit. And up until very recently, that means the returns were almost non-existent, because if you go and you look at the market information for most of these types of securities, you'll find that they don't get much return, because up until and through at least the upcoming month, the US Treasury has been buying a lot of it, which has kept interest rates low. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. That's about to change, but they're still, generally speaking, highly restrictive. And we're very highly restricted here in North Carolina in terms of how we can invest public money. And again, that's controlled by the local government commission. So lots of examples here of balancing tricks. And these are used by governments all the time. They're used at the federal level, they're used at the state level, they're used at the local level. Probably the most common, or at the top, the first two, over-enthusiastic projections, or rosy projections, as Mike Sell puts it. That's just the idea that revenues are going to be greater than what's realistic, and expenditures, particularly when you're looking at from a long-term perspective, are going to be less than what they actually are going to have to be. You typically see it on the revenue side in terms of how governments project economic growth. And you see it on the expenditure side when they have new facilities or new programs, that they have a tendency to underestimate the cost of providing those new services and programs. So those are very common and are often used. The use of one-time revenues. This gets back to, like, as I think he talks about in this case, asset purchases, asset sales. I mean, like selling land or selling other assets and using that money to balance the budget. Ideally, when you do those kind of one-time revenues, they should be used for one-time expenses, or they should be put in reserve. But a lot of times people will take those one-time revenues and put them and actually use them in their budget. Inter-budget manipulation, particularly if you're working with multiple appropriations, but also that's very common, in that you can move that. You can manipulate budgets to be able to shift costs from one to another. If you've got more capacity in one area than you do in another financial capacity, and this is often done with inter-fund budgeting, you can move money or move expense or shift revenue from one fund to another to facilitate that. Bubbles and timing. I'll give you a personal example from Virginia. I worked up in Northern Virginia before the real estate crash. We had a very active real estate market at that time. And in North Carolina, at that time, I think it's still in place, but there was a significant tax on the recording of property transactions. And this was a revenue that, prior to the pickup of the revenue of the real estate industry, they were generating maybe $250,000, $300,000 a year. And that went up to about $3 million. If we had it all over to do all over again, we would have been trying to find ways to not spend that money or as much of that money on current expenditures. But at the time, because of growth, because of various growth challenges and how growth was affecting our need to expand programs and services, we were spending the money like it was regularly reoccurring revenue. After I left, when the property markets crashed, that recordation tax evaporated, went from where it had been at $3 million to even less than where it had been before the boom. And that's a significant loss of current revenue. And that, along with challenges in sales tax and challenges in other areas, meant that they faced a significant financial crisis in terms of being able to cover current expenditures. And one of the solutions they did was they actually laid off staff, which happens very rarely at the local levels of government. It happens some at state levels more often, but it rarely happens at local levels of government. And basically they did it on a Friday afternoon. They picked out the staff that was going to be laid off, and they told them, they had a meeting, and then they told them that afternoon they were gone. It was not a very pleasant experience from all the reports that I read and from the people I talked to afterwards. Ducking the decision. Does anybody want to explain this one?
I would say just kicking the can down the road.
That's another way of putting it. Absolutely. Carolyn, you have anything you want to add?
Well, I didn't quite understand this one, so maybe this isn't quite right, but I was thinking about how like when budgets aren't quite as clear about how the money is to be spent, that's kind of ducking the decision, because then you're not necessarily making the choice about how the money will be allocated, and somebody else will have to do it when they're actually enacting the budget.
That's another way of putting it. It's so both are correct.
Is it like when they table the discussions?
It can be, but the money's still allocated or not allocated. It can take a variety of forms. It can be, a common example is we'll study it. When it comes to a new program, if they don't want to spend the money or they don't have the money, they'll just say, hey, we'll study it. Or they will do a pilot program, or they'll extend a pilot program. That can happen a lot as well. Brittany, you're right, claiming a smaller deficit can be one. Delegating cost, this does happen in North Carolina from time to time. There was actually an effort. I'd been with the city for a couple of years here in North Carolina, and there was an effort to force, one of the ways that the state tried, they failed in this case, but one of the ways that they tried to delegate cost was they tried to make local governments pay credit hour fees for the continuing education that was facilitated through community colleges for public safety employees. If you happen to be a police officer or firefighter, or know somebody as a police officer and firefighter, you know that there are requirements as part of their certifications for continuing education on an annual basis. And typically those credits are facilitated in most jurisdictions, like Rocky Mount, through our local community colleges. We provide the staff for these programs. We also provide the staff for their basic level training programs in law enforcement and fire prevention. And typically it's kind of an understanding, and they don't apply those costs, so they keep those costs fairly low. They wanted to charge us a standard rate. And for us, if we use that with respect to all of our staff and the hours that they have to have, it was going to be about a $300,000 to $400,000 increase in our cost per year. And that was going to be significant. And so as we were getting towards the end of the budget, as we were preparing our budget, we had it in there. And then at the last minute, enough fire chiefs and police chiefs and legislators got together and realized this wasn't such a good idea. So they didn't punt it. They didn't delegate those costs to us that time. One thing that often happens that's kind of like an internal delegation in state government here is they will move certain operations to where they have to be reliant on fees. This is a common budget balancing trick in North Carolina that I've seen with administrative departments when I've read through the budget, in that there are in North Carolina, in their budget, you can align expenditures with the fees collected to provide the service. And so what they'll do is they'll say, well, we need to balance the budget. So we need to shift some employees from where their monies are paid for out of general appropriations to where they're fee-based, where they're fee supported. It happens in education, happens in other services. And that can be a huge challenge because in some cases, these agencies may have the authority to raise revenues from fees. In other cases, they may not. But that is an example of delegation. There's the one that he talks about, this the magical asterisk, or I refer to it as calling it magical savings. You see this more often at the federal level, where they can just assume savings are going to occur through various programs, and they try to incorporate that in the budget. Like, hey, we'll find 150, 200,000, we'll find 150, $200 million in savings somewhere and still appropriate the budget and assume it'll balance. Sometimes it happens at the state level, not as much at the local level, because particularly in local governments where they use line item budgets, they have to identify what those savings are going to be. At least from a financial perspective, there may be challenges where those savings impact performance, and department heads and staff have to then work on that. Getting back to the favorite topic of pensions, there's, punting the pension or other, what's called, other post-employment benefits, or OPEB. In North Carolina, the biggest challenge with that is the state retiree health system. It has a considerable negative balance in terms of when you look at its future costs compared to what's currently available in reserve. Prior treasurers, I think the last two, both Treasurer Cowell and Treasurer Fowle, have made recommendations on what needs to be done to correct this. It requires legislative appropriations, and the General Assembly, for the most part, have said, yeah, but we'd rather spend the money on something else or use the money for something else. So they don't necessarily match up to the need that is there to go ahead and provide those funds at the present time, which puts more pressure on them providing those funds later. And then the last one is what's known as securitization. And this is the vehicle that this is referred to in financing is known as anticipation notes. They use the example of the tobacco settlement of the late 90s, early 2000s. In some smaller jurisdictions, there may be the need to realize revenues that are, from a timing perspective, not going to occur until a certain time after they would be needed. This is not as much a budget issue as it is a financial management issue and a cash management issue. There is one that you see in a few places known as a tax anticipation note. And this is kind of a short-term bridge financing that is used by a jurisdiction that, for example, if they know that they can't cover their expenditures up until when they receive all their property taxes, because property taxes are usually only collected once or twice a year, they will borrow money for that period of time until they collect the taxes, and then they'll pay it off. But they still got to pay interest and fees on that borrowing. In transportation, there are bond issues. These are known as GARVs. That are very common. Many states use them. North Carolina's used them, where they will borrow against anticipated future funding from the federal government. They kind of have an idea based on a transportation appropriation, which is a multi-year bill passed by Congress. They have an idea of how much money they're going to get each year for infrastructure projects. And so they can go out and borrow with the understanding that that money is going to come to them and they can be able to pay it off over a certain time. So that's an example of securitization. And it's become a more common practice. Are there any questions or comments with respect to these balancing tricks?
I'm just curious with this pandemic, what that's really done to your work as far as trying to do budgeting. Like, are there more tricks that now you have because we've gone through this for 2 years?
No, I didn't pick up any new tricks. I'll tell you that right now. I didn't pick up any new tricks, and I try my best not to use them. I should say that as a teacher. I should also say that as a professional. But what I will say is that clearly you face some challenges in figuring out how to distribute cost responsibly across the resources you have. From a regulatory perspective, the more general fund appropriations that I have from the resources that are considered general, like property tax, sales tax, those types of revenues, the more resources I have from that, the better off I am, because the limits on how we can use them are much less. So, for example, when you have emergency expenditures, and I'll give you an example. Early on in the pandemic, we had a situation where our local homeless shelter called us and needed help arranging for what's called non-congregate shelter. Shelters typically, particularly adult shelters, not family shelters, but adult shelters typically operate, many still operate like ours, where it's a dormitory setting, where there's a common sleeping area, where there's bunk beds and such. And obviously, if you have clients in those shelters that have COVID, they can't be in those spaces. So you've got to find other places to put them. At this point, the nonprofits were not able to ask for money directly from the federal government to assist them. And in our case, even though the state did have a program to help provide hotel rooms and such, none of our local hotels were willing to take the assistance. They couldn't be forced to take the assistance. So none of them were taking it. So we had to figure out a way to do it. And what we did was that we entered into an agreement with our shelter, and we used some of our coronavirus relief fund money. And it was we had to first of all make sure it was an eligible use of this money. But basically, we helped them rent out a house that was close to the shelter, that had bedrooms they could use to house their infected population in a non-congregate setting. They could basically keep them in those units for 2 weeks. And we did that for several months. And we were able to structure it in such a way, and we were able to be able to do everything to the satisfaction of the Pandemic Recovery Office at the state level, that we knew that we could use the state funds. Now, if I just said, let me just use general fund dollars, it would have been much easier process. We could have just simply given them the allocation. As long as council approved it, we could have just given them the allocation. But the reality was, at that time, was I didn't feel comfortable spending any more general fund dollars than I had, even though revenues were looking good, even though our expenditures were controlled. You didn't know what the next shoe was going to drop. So you're sitting there, you're in good shape, but you're also not wanting to put yourself in bad shape by spending money on something that you could otherwise find a source for. And right now, like with the rescue plan money that cities have received, for me, it's trying to make sure that we use that money in a way that does not create long-term costs for us as a jurisdiction. We're getting this huge one-time allocation. For us, it's $11.5 million. And Greensboro's gotten a lot more. And so have other larger cities in North Carolina. And there's a lot of different ways you can spend the money. But what you want to do is that, ideally, from an operational perspective and from a planning perspective, is you don't want to spend it in a way that increases future operating costs. So, you don't want to create new programs, even if that's something you need. There's no argument. I'm not arguing against new programs, but you don't, unless you've got certain capital needs that can be one time, you've got to be careful with how you plan it and how you budget for it. It poses a lot of challenges. Okay. Any other questions? All right. So when I want to talk about the North Carolina Local Budget and Fiscal Control Act, it is a section of the North Carolina General Statutes, and it does provide some significant guidance for us as local governments in how we budget and also how we manage finances at the municipal and county level. First of all, these are some just general there's a lot of information in the act, but there were a couple of things I wanted to point out specifically. First of all, it establishes the fiscal year for local governments as starting July 1st and ending June 30th. So that is set in stone in North Carolina. Excuse me. It also provides statutory guidelines for budget preparation. And this is of special interest to most people in this audience and most people in North Carolina, because most people in North Carolina live in council manager forms of government at the local level, whether they be in a municipality or county. In the Budget and Fiscal Control Act, if you live in a council manager form of government, the jurisdiction's manager is considered the budget officer. So they're responsible for preparing the budget, for submitting it to their governing body for review and approval, and then also for managing the budget once it's adopted. Now that responsibility can be delegated to another member of staff. In such case, in Rocky Mount, it's delegated to me. But it means that the development of the budget is a process that is led by staff. It's not led by the elected officials. It is a direct responsibility of the professional manager. It also provides guidance that budgets, when they're prepared internally by the jurisdiction staff, should go through a process where the departments that report to the manager are responsible for preparing budget submissions that are reviewed by the manager and then brought together and balanced and coordinated into an overall budget. So it's not the council figuring just kind of saying this is how much money we're going to spend, and it's not just the manager saying this is how much money I'm going to spend. I want to put in the budget, and this is how I want to distribute it. It's not a top-down approach; it's a bottom-up approach, and that's what's communicated in the statutes. It defines balanced budget, which I've described before. And it establishes that the general fund and that the annual operating funds of a government, which include utilities, some special operating funds, internal service funds, and so on, are appropriated annually through a budget ordinance. But there is a separate kind of budgeting that can be used for what are considered multi-year projects. And what we mean by a multi-year project is that this is tied to a specific project that would take more than a year to complete and is funded by a specific external funding, by a specific funding source. So there's a couple of examples that I'll go through. So several years back, Rocky Mount built an event center. We issued a special purpose bond to fund the construction of the event center. That qualified us to use multi-year budgeting for the expenditures associated with this. What multi-year budgeting means is that the appropriations don't end at the end of the fiscal year. In an annual operating budget, the appropriations expire at the end of that given fiscal year. So like the budget that everybody currently has in place, if they're annual, that started July 1st of last year, those appropriations expire on June 30th. So the jurisdiction has to have a new budget that takes effect July 1st in place to be able to continue to technically to continue to operate, to provide money for appropriations. Under a multi-year budget, the appropriation does not end until you close the appropriation. You have to do what's called a closeout ordinance. So that allows you then to spend the money for as long as you need to spend it. So we use it for for a bond funded project like the event center. And that allows us to properly manage it, to be able to properly account for it as a separate capital project within our jurisdiction's operations. We also use it when we receive federal grants. We receive federal grants for public transportation because we run our public transportation operations here. We receive them for community development through HUD's CDBG and home reinvestment block grant programs. We receive them for public safety to help with the purchasing of bulletproof vests and equipment for police. We've also received it for fire assistance. And then there's the money that we received as part of the rescue plan. Because federal fiscal years are different than state and local fiscal years in most places, the federal fiscal year starts October 1st and ends September 30th. And also their appropriations the way in which they distribute appropriations are unique. It is important that we have flexibility in how those funds can be used. And so because they're accounted for separately from your general monies and from those funds that you generate yourself, they are handled through multi-year project budgets, which is an easier way of managing it. I'm going to just go if you work in a budget, if you end up working in a budget office, particularly at the local level in North Carolina, I strongly encourage you to take the time to read through these statutes. It is definitely something that gives you great guidance in understanding how the process works in North Carolina, what to expect, and what you're allowed to do. It reads like legislation, so it's not the easiest thing in the world to read. It doesn't change much. There have been some changes over the years. That goes back to this bill itself goes back to 1973. But it talks about budgets. It talks about budget request. The parts of the budget that are required. For example, a budget has to have what's known as when the city manager submits the budget to council, along with all the line items and such, it has to have what's known as a budget message, which is basically like a letter that explains what's in the budget. And that's something that I'm responsible for writing for the manager. They read it, they edit it, they put their signature on it, and it's the first thing that when you open up the budget book, it's the first thing that anybody who reads it sees, because it provides the narrative explanation of everything that's in the budget. There is guidance in here about how long, for example, here on page 4, not earlier than 10 days after the day the budget is presented to the board and not later than July 10th, the governing board shall adopt a budget ordinance. What that's basically saying is you can't do it. You can't just give it to them and then adopt it that day. So this is a transparency provision because it provides time for the council to review it. It also provides time for the public to review it. And that includes that includes, there's the requirement for a public hearing is in here as well. Looking to see. There's a provision. I'm trying to remember where it is. It talks about amendments that have to be made. Talks about capital reserve funds if you choose to use that. The role of fiscal control with the finance officer getting into financial management. there is a provision in here that says that, as I said before, requires that you have a public hearing. And that's required to be hosted before you can adopt the budget. But there is some excellent information. Brittany, you were saying, would this include all city departments, I assume, in terms of how budgets are submitted?
Yes, sir. I was referring to when you said that, like when the city manager goes to present the budget to the council, would he have everything from every city department? And then does every department head give their budget to him, or would each department head go to the council on their own?
They give it to the manager and the manager presents the budget. Depending on the jurisdiction and depending on the relationship and the nature of the relationship between manager and council, the council may encourage more engagement with departments, with department heads and talking about their budget. But generally speaking, and especially here in North Carolina, that budget is the responsibility of the manager and maybe one other delegate, i.e. the budget person. And it's our job to communicate all this information because we're trying to present it from a holistic perspective. So typically the way budget direction works is that the departments are given instructions by the management office in terms of how they should prepare their budgets. That's also included here in the Budget and Fiscal Control Act. They're given deadlines. This says they have to submit to the manager by April 30th, but it can be earlier. Like ours is second week of March. And then we have to have then we review everything, we bring everything together, and then the manager presents that budget with all the departments tied into it to council. Okay, let me read Trudell's question. Are bond funded projects always on local ballots due to them being multi-year projects, or can the elected officials vote? So when it comes to bonds, the North Carolina Constitution, and this goes back to what powers should be given to elected representatives and how much should be given to people directly. The North Carolina Constitution stipulates that general obligation debt must be approved by voter referendum, whether it be at the state or the local level. And that's done as a matter of giving the public a voice when it comes to those types of debt instruments. Subsequent court rulings have determined that other kinds of debt, primarily debt that's for special purposes or that is secured by assets or revenue from utilities or other types of debt, do not have to go for referendum. They still have to be approved by the local government commission, but they do not require a public referendum. In the last couple of years, there's been some changes to General Assembly rules, to general statutes about when you can have bond elections. And now they pretty much want to align them with when you have other elections to where you don't have a special election, which decreases turnout usually. You try to have them at a time where you can where you have the greatest potential for turnout. And also, even though it's recommended that you apply that council approves a multi-year budget ordinance to handle the appropriation of that funds, it's not required. So using multi-year budgeting is a tool that we have. We could use to have it just be part of the annual budget process, but we don't. At least not here. There are other places that may choose for it just to be part of their annual budget process, but we choose not to. And that's totally separate. Normally, you would not do the budget ordinance until after you've gotten the approval for the bond, because without the bond approval, there's no need to do the ordinance. Anybody else got any other questions at this time? Okay. So we've come to the close of the lecture portion of tonight's tonight's class. I just want to talk about the assignment for next week. Next week, it'll be a recorded session that you'll be able to watch on YouTube. We will not meet back for live lecture until March 14th due to spring break. So next week's lecture will be the last lecture before spring break, and it's also night that I have a council meeting. We'll be talking about the federal budget and budget approval, which means you'll need to read, which means that the text that we'll be going over is chapter 4. The lab next week will also focus on expenditures. The lab assignment, which I will do some demoing of tonight, will be distributed tomorrow, and the deadline for the assignment due back to me by midnight on Friday, March 4th. So you'll get it done before spring break officially starts. So let's take a 15-minute break, and we will be back on to do the lab at 8 p.m.